So you became president 11 months ago. Can you again describe some of the actions you took? For example, you cut half the number of government ministries, layoffs, removed price controls. It would be interesting to lay out the first steps and what's next.
If you allow me, I will first give you a description of the situation we received, and based on that, I will tell you each of the things we did. When we first took office, basically what we found was that in the first week of December, inflation was rising at a rate of 1% per day, which means 3,700% annually. In the first half of December, it had accelerated to 7,500% annually. When you look at wholesale inflation in December of last year, it was 54%, which if annualized would equate to an inflation rate of 17,000% per year. And in addition, Argentina, for the previous 10 years, had not been growing, with a drop in GDP per capita of approximately 15%. And the reality was that nearly 50% were living in poverty. Now, later I will get deeper into that discussion. And the reality is that we had a fiscal deficit which amounted to 15% of GDP. 5 points were in the Treasury, 10 points were in the central bank, which was endogenous monetary issuance. And the reality is that we also had interest-bearing liabilities at the central bank equivalent to 4 monetary bases, maturing in one day, meaning we could have quintupled the amount of money in one day. We had peso-denominated maturities amounting to the equivalent of $90 billion. The central bank had negative net currency foreign reserves, minus $12 billion. We had commercial debts in the central bank equivalent to $50 billion. There were company dividends held back amounting to $10 billion. Therefore, if we had instantly opened up, you see, I say we are liberal libertarians, we are not liberal fools. That's what some anarchist liberals suggested, meaning that we basically open everything on the first day. So in that context, of course, if we had done that, we would have encountered hyperinflation. Therefore, that would have led to the number of poor people being around 95%, and by December, the Peronist Party would have organized supermarkets lootings and would have done all sorts of things and would have probably been ousted. And by the first part of the year, the Peronists would have gone back to office. So to us, it was crucial to end fiscal deficit. One of the things we promised during the campaign had been to reduce the number of ministries. And indeed, we reduced to less than half the number of ministries because we went to 9 ministries. Today we have 8. We have also laid off a large number of civil employees. Today I can say that we have already dismissed about 50,000 of them. And we practically don't renew any contracts unless the positions are absolutely necessary. At the same time, we have stopped public works and we have eliminated discretionary transfers to the provinces. We have also diluted public sector wages. Also, we have eliminated economic subsidies by restoring utility rates to the right levels. And and in that, let's say in this context, we achieved fiscal balance as far as the Treasury is concerned. This is very important because in the last 123 years, Argentina had a deficit for 113 of them, and in the 10 years it did not have a deficit because it was not paying the debt. So that was absolutely false. And they told us it would be impossible to do that. We had planned to do so within a year. And they said it wasn't possible to adjust by more than 1 percentage point. And we achieved fiscal balance in the month of January, that is the first month of administration. At the same time, we also cut social plans linked to intermediation. This is very important because we knew we were going to make a very tough adjustment, and we knew that this was going to have a cost in social terms. And we knew that we had to offer support during the first month, the first quarter and second quarter in office. One of the things we did was to eliminate what are known as poverty managers, that is, intermediaries. Basically, people have a card through which they receive assistance, but it happens that they had to provide a counter service, and that counter service was verified by a group called the Piqueteros. So, in that context, when they were going to sign, the counter service took away half of the money. So, by removing that payoff, they stopped extorting them, stopped stealing their money, and with the same amount of money, they received double the resources. And of course, we also provided an additional boost. So, let's say that this is related to the 5 adjustment points in the Treasury. Now, what happens? As we began to achieve fiscal balance and no longer needed to issue money to finance ourselves, and as we also met interest payments and some capital repayments, one of the things that happened is that the debt market began to be recreated. So we were able to take debt out of the central bank and transfer it to the Treasury, where it should have always been. And that meant an adjustment of approximately 10% of GDP. Everyone said this would be impossible and couldn't be fixed. Essentially, what we did was implement a fiscal adjustment at the central bank amounting to 10% of GDP. So, if you ask me, it's clear that we have not only made the biggest fiscal adjustment in the history of humanity, because we made a fiscal adjustment of 15 points of the GDP, but also most of that went back to the people as less seigniorage, as a lower inflation rate. It's true that we temporarily raised the country tax, but we lowered it in September. And now in December, we're going to eliminate it. Today, for example, we also announced that in December, we are eliminating import taxes. In fact, in that regard, what you have is that we return to the people 13.5 points of GDP, because the real tax burden is the size of the state. So, while back in December we were discussing hyperinflation, today we are discussing 30-year loans. In other words, all those resources that the national government used to take are now back in the private sector. And that's what has allowed it to be very dynamic. And this has 2 very strong impacts. The first one is that if you look at wholesale inflation, it went down from 54% to 2%, so it went down by 27 times. It was divided into 27. So we had inflation at a rate of 17,000% annually, and it's now close to about 28% a year. But it's not only that. You could consider consumer inflation. The latest consumer inflation rate was 2.7%. Now it happens that we, essentially due to a matter that is related to the central bank's balance sheets and also due to the debt stocks, we still have controls in place and we are eliminating restrictions day by day. Now, the interesting thing is that we have a 2% monthly devaluation standard, and there's international inflation, of course, which means that you then have to subtract 2.5 points from the inflation observed by the consumer. This indicates that inflation in Argentina, the true inflation, not the induced one, but the actual monetary inflation, is 0.2% per month. At 0.2% per month, this equates to 2.4% annually. What I'm saying is, the original discussion was about whether inflation could reach 17,000%. Now we are bringing inflation down to levels of 2.5% annually, and that is amazing. And we achieved this by considering a number of factors. The first one is that we did not experience a previous hyperinflation, which would have simplified the process of implementing a stabilization program. Typically, when hyperinflation occurs, monetary assets are diluted, leading to a natural restoration of demand. And besides, we did not resort to any expropriation. For example, before the convertibility plan, which was the most successful program in Argentina's history, Argentina experienced two instances of hyperinflation. During Alfonsin's administration, inflation reached 5,000%, and under Menem, it was 1,200%. Additionally, there was the Bonex plan, under which debt was exchanged on a compulsory basis. In other words, what we did instead was clean up the central bank balance sheet. So with that, we cleaned up the central bank's balance sheet. We cleared a loss of $45 billion, all voluntarily. And the most amazing thing is that we did it in just 6 months. And at the same time, we have not controlled prices, nor have we fixed the exchange rate. And this is very important. All previous stabilization programs, in an effort to show quick results, used to do this. What they would do is, before announcing the plan, they would adjust the rates, and once the rates were adjusted, they would launch the plan. But in our case, we couldn't afford that luxury, so we had to implement it on the go. And also over the past few months, that is to say, companies brought in rates that covered only about 10%, whereas today they cover 80%, so you get the picture. Just imagine the adjustment we are making, and in that sense, it is also incredible what we have achieved, because if we were to work with the inflation we have in our country today, considering the exchange rate situation, the figures are even better than during the convertibility program, which was the most successful economic program in Argentina's history. And in fact, there is an article called Passing the Buck, which is by Gerardo de la Paulera Bozzoli and Irigoyen, that demonstrates that Menem's first government was the best government in history. And basically, it argues two things in the success of the stabilization of the convertibility program. So if you take a closer look, when you examine it carefully, when you account for all these factors, our disinflation process is actually much more genuine. And not only that, it's also much deeper. We restored freedoms to Argentinians while simultaneously implementing a structural reform 8 times larger. And we accomplished this with 15% of the representatives, 10% of the senators, and within the first 6 months of government. In other words, our deregulation agenda continues daily, and we still have 3,200 structural reforms pending. This will ultimately make Argentina the freest country in the world. Moreover, to have a sense of magnitude, the reforms that we already have made with the Executive Order 7023 and with the basis law, we have actually jumped 90 places in terms of economic freedom. What this means is that today, Argentina has institutions similar to those of Germany, France, Italy, and we obviously want this to continue. And let's say we are going to surpass, no doubt, the levels of economic freedom that Ireland reached in its best moment. And not only that, we're going to exceed the levels of economic freedom of Australia, New Zealand, and Switzerland. We are undoubtedly going to be the freest country in the world. And this means that thanks to what we've done today, we are on a path that allows us to multiply our per capita GDP by 2.5 times when you apply the relevant correction. And this, of course, is something very interesting because it implies a huge increase in well-being. And furthermore, today the Argentinian economy is already strongly and amazingly recovering. And we can say, analysts' hypotheses were suggesting that next year we would be growing between 5 and 6%. Today, JP Morgan has now corrected. or let's say revise the projections upwards. And besides, when we normalize the price situation, the true poverty rate came up and it was 57% in January. Today it is at 46%, meaning we lowered poverty by 11 percentage points. Let's say, it seems truly like a miracle. And not only that, but actually not a single job was lost in the process. When it comes to all of this inflation reduction process, people said that our economy and economic activity would collapse. And actually, when you look at the deseasonalized data, you see that in August there was a recovery that took us back to December levels. That means that in the year we made the largest fiscal adjustment in the history of humanity. We will end up with less inflation, fewer poor people, better real wages, and additionally a GDP higher than what we started with. And if you look at it in dollars, I can assure you that the numbers are phenomenal. Because basically today the dollar is below the levels we had when we took office. So the reality is that, and all of this, when you take my popularity levels and the government's acceptance levels, today they are above the moment we assumed office. If you know that the moment of maximum popularity is when you take office. Therefore, this means that far from resting on our laurels with this, we're going for more reforms. We're going to deepen the reforms, and I tell you, we won't stop until Argentina is the freest country in the world. Furthermore, a recent work by an Argentinian economist named Juan Pablo Nicolini was presented at the central bank's monetary meetings, and he works at the Federal Reserve. And it's interesting because he shows that only on the basis of what we have done in fiscal matters, it ensures that in the span of 10 years, we can double the GDP per capita, meaning that Argentina could grow at rates of 7% annually, which is very much, and that has strong consequences in terms of improving quality of life, reducing poverty, reducing indigence. Therefore, if during the worst moment our image didn't suffer and we stayed strong in our ideas, now that everything is working much better, why should we change? On the contrary, we are ready to redouble the bet, to redouble our efforts because we've done things that no one else has done. I will give you an example. There's something that seems trivial, but there's what's called the single paper ballot. Argentina used to vote with huge ballots, which were above all, very costly, and that reform, let's say it wasn't done because it always harmed the ruling party. So everyone talked about going to the single paper ballot, but no one did it when they were in power. They didn't want to implement it because they preferred to commit fraud or use some kind of trickery to avoid applying that rule that makes the election more competitive. Well, what's interesting, we sent that law and it was approved. What's more, now we are finishing with the open, simultaneous and mandatory primaries because it was a mechanism by which politics was also stealing. We are eliminating the financing of political parties. If you look, we have reduced the fiscal pressure by 15 points to the Argentinians. We are restoring freedoms with a deep set of structural and regulatory reforms. That is, I think that any sensible liberal could perceive we are already delivering a wonderful government. In fact, it's the best government in the history of Argentina. If the best had been that of Menem, we've already outpaced him.
Maybe you can explain to me the metrics of poverty and unemployment, because you said unemployment went down, real unemployment went down, real poverty went down. But even that aside, what have been the most painful impacts of these radical reforms? And how many of them are required in the short term to have a big positive impact in the long term?
Let's take it step by step, all right? That is, In fact, we started to do things right, therefore we did not create poverty. The poverty was an inherited poverty. The point is that what we did was to reveal it. I'll try to explain it with an example that I think clarifies what's happening in Argentina. Argentina was an economy that had a total price controls. It had a fiscal deficit which was financed through money printing. Just for you, to give you an idea. In the last year, Argentina financed 13 points of the gross domestic product with money printing. In other words, a real disaster. So that situation provoked this artificially demand and puts pressure on prices. The issue is that price controls are applied additionally over the prices that they enter the price index with which inflation was. I'm not saying they were lying about it, it was distorted. And since Argentina measures poverty and indigence by income line, then what happens? That distorted the true levels of poverty, of course. But that's not the only effect. I mean, let's say the real poverty levels were higher, quite a bit higher than those shown by the previous government, which showed them at 41% and also did so on a 6-monthly basis. So if you, let's say, have a growing trend, they are actually leaving you a bomb and you don't see it. Because let's say basically the indicator was measured with a delayed form. But not only that, imagine that you are also given, you are in the middle of an island, alone, and they give you $1 million. What can you do with that? You cannot do anything because you cannot buy anything. It's the same as if someone tells you that the price of glasses is $10, but when you want to buy it, it's not available. Actually, there's a joke told by an Argentinian professor named Juan Carlos de Pablo, who says that a man goes to a bazaar and asks for a vase. Then he says to him, "Well, I want that vase. How much would you charge me?" Then he says, $5,000. Oh, okay, $5,000, but why $5,000 if across the street it's 1,000? He says, well, go buy it across the street for 1,000. Ah, there's none for 1,000. Well, then here, when there's more, it'll also cost 1,000. In other words, prices at which they are available. So what happens? When you are faced with that situation, the supermarket shelves were empty. So what was the point of having a price at which you couldn't buy anything? You left those prices, the shelves were empty, so the statistics showed that you were much better. But the reality is you couldn't buy anything. You couldn't make it happen. So if you left the situation as it was, people were going to starve because they couldn't buy anything. Yes, they had a certain amount of money that could supposedly buy certain goods, but those goods were not available. What is the only thing you can do to save people? Make the prices transparent and allow products to reappear. Well, when you make the prices transparent, you also make transparent the cost of the basic food basket and the total basic basket, meaning the poverty line, the indigence line and the poverty line respectively. And when you do that, clearly you will see a jump in poverty. That brought poverty up to 57%. Now, Argentina found its activity floor in the month of April. From that moment, Argentina began to invent a cyclical recovery. Real wages have been growing every month above inflation. Therefore, nominal wages are beating inflation. In fact, we are already at levels similar to those we had in November. The same goes for pensions. Moreover, also let's say there is a rebound in activity due to the recovery of the stock cycle. Therefore, this is also contributing to more and better paid jobs. In fact, this is so strong and evident that the wages growing the most are in the informal sector. This means that poverty and extreme poverty are decreasing much faster than we imagined. But not only that, by eliminating inflation, you remove the inflationary tax. But the real burden is the fiscal deficit, which was 15 points of the GDP. Okay, we temporarily raised the country tax, now we lower it, but we returned that to the Argentinians. We gave back 15 points of the GDP, Not only that, but also, when you eliminate inflation, you remove the distortion of relative prices. Therefore, the allocation of resources is much better. Not only that, but also with the strong fiscal adjustment we made, we have reduced the country risk from 3,000 basis points to 770. Today, Fitch raised Argentina's rating to triple C. So, what do I mean? That translates into a lower country risk and interest rates, and that generates an increase in investment, also generates an increase in consumption. In other words, the Argentinian economy is currently in an absolutely flourishing moment. And how is that sustained in the long term? With structural reforms, which we implement daily, deregulating the economy and introducing new laws that free Argentinians from the many oppressive measures that have burdened it over the past 100 years.